Right, so I'll begin in that case if the meeting has started. So a very welcome, a very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from, but a very warm welcome to esteemed speakers, colleagues, and participants around the world to today's webinar dialogue on COP30 outcomes and the road ahead for global climate action. My name is Danielle Yao, the Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, where I lead the Climate Change Law and Policy Program. On behalf of the Center for International Law, we are absolutely delighted to be partnering Durham University's Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy in today's a very important discussion. What reflections can we draw some 4 months now, post COP30? Digesting and understanding the implications of these decisions can be challenging for different stakeholders based in different regions of the world. What does the future of global climate action look, especially given recent global geopolitical and economic developments, which we will also hear from the panelists on later? Today's discussion offers a very unique cross-regional perspective and conversation on these questions. Now, before we proceed further, I'd like to invite my partner in crime, Professor Petra Minarup from Durham Universities, to deliver a very brief welcome remarks on her end. Petra, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and very warm greetings here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone in the audience, and many thanks to Danielle, but also to our distinguished speakers who are joining us at a very early hour for those who are in New York, especially. So thank you for making the time for this. I think it's extremely important that we keep these dialogues going between the COPs. We are well ahead now, turning the curve into now COP31. And as we know, it's a very challenging circumstances we are facing. So I think keeping this conversation between professionals, academia, and negotiators going is extremely important. And I'm absolutely delighted to be partnering with Danielle and the Center for International Law and all our speakers. My name is Petra Minarup, as Danielle already said. I'm Professor of International Law and the Director for the Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy, and I serve also as the Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Sustainability at Durham University. And many of you have seen already in person and will see again soon, which is amazing. So this is, of course, our virtual environment. It is slightly more challenging, so bear with us if the technique doesn't hold, but so far it's going well, and we will have some slides to share as well with you later on, some of the speakers, and we also hope for a very interactive session. So please keep your questions coming throughout the seminar, and we will then after the initial short introductory remarks of each speaker. So without further ado, I hand back to our chair of this session today, to Danielle, and thank you again very much. I'm looking forward to this. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Petra. And also, I should just say a short note. I've just been informed that one of our intended speakers, Professor Elisa Mogera, unfortunately, for unforeseen reasons, is unable to join us, and thus send her apologies for this late development. But nonetheless, we have a full slate of very fascinating, brilliant speakers who will no doubt share their collective wisdom and insights with us today. So very briefly, just recalling COP30 and drawing, if I may, from a recent lecture by Singapore's chief negotiator for climate change, Mr. Joseph Teo, multilateralism is alive and well, despite the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, with other parties demonstrating sustained commitment and unity in collective efforts to achieve the Paris Agreement goals and in Balam. The Global Mutayara Decision, also known as the Balam Political Package, delivered decisions on key issues, and among these were initiatives to accelerate climate mitigation and to strengthen implementation, as well as agreed modalities to implement the first global stocktake outcomes. Now, on the flip side, no consensus on deforestation and fossil fuel transition was reached. What emerged instead were two new COP30 presidency-led roadmaps to transition away from fossil fuels and on halting and reversing deforestation. Parties also agreed to strengthen adaptation action and support with, among others, adoption of 59 Balam adaptation indicators. Amongst other outcomes, these include operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund, reaffirmation of the previously agreed new collective quantified goal on climate finance, and other outcomes that relate to just transition, to technology transfer, the Balam Gender Action Plan, mountains and climate change dialogue, and of course, on this important question of climate and trade nexus. Now, on top of these COP decisions, there were a plethora of COP30 presidency action agenda initiatives. We think about the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, for example, and we have plurilateral initiatives such as the Initiative on Climate Change Information Integrity, Open Coalition on Compliance Carbon Markets, just to say a few. So to further dissect the COP outcomes and also, very importantly, with an eye to the future, each of our speakers will be invited to speak for about 10 minutes or so each. That will preserve more time for our roundtable dialogue and a Q&A to follow. We have invited the speakers to also then comment and respond to each other's remarks. Participants and attendees, of which there are from around the world, we have over 100 plus participants, showing the huge focus and interest in this topic. You are encouraged to please type in your comments and questions using the Q&A chat function, please. And with that, and with the speaker's permission, I will briefly introduce each of you and invite the participants to please refer to the bios on the event webpage. So first off, may I invite and introduce His Excellency Ambassador Francois Jadman. He's the permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations. And before and the permanent representative, of course, based in New York. So very thank you to joining us in this very early hours of the morning for you. Now, before his latest appointment, Ambassador Jadman served as the ambassador to China. He has held various senior positions relating to trade and foreign affairs since entering the government service in 1995. So over to you now, Ambassador Jadman.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I hope that you can all hear me. And if you can, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be able to join you again, albeit only virtual, in virtual form, to see so many friendly and familiar faces, and really to thank the two centers for the excellent work that they're doing in this very important area. I'm happy to see you all, although despite the fact that it's 4:30 in the morning here in New York, and that with your permission, I will sip this cup of coffee from time to time to keep me going. So let me, if I may ask Kate, perhaps to put up the few slides that I have, then I can begin my few comments. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Kate. Right, yes. So when I was preparing, when I was thinking about how to approach the discussion today, I remembered that not that long ago, a number of us were together in Durham in October before COP30. And so I went back to my presentation at that event, and I've just drawn up the slide, the concluding slide from that presentation, where I had 4 takeaways, which you see here before you. And I thought it would be interesting to compare these takeaways in October to the situation now. And so I think slides, the takeaways 2 and 3 are still very much clear and have not changed. But slides 1 and 4, I think, are conclusions 1 and 4 are conclusions that are worth returning to. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Kate.
Sure.
I'd said then in October, ahead of COP30, that the geopolitical atmosphere was cloudy. And Kate, if you'll move to the next bit on the slide, I've revised my estimates. It's not cloudy, it's downright stormy now. Those of you who are here in New York and elsewhere will know that the geopolitical clouds have gathered like hurricane that we in the Caribbean are all too familiar with. And they are threatening, if not already, I think, beginning to wreak some serious damage on the international system that we have known for the last 30 or 40 years, which for all of its imperfections had begun to yield some positive benefits for a significant number of countries. And just as a reminder of what's happened in the last 5 to 6 months, we've had the events in Venezuela, just very close to Barbados. We've had the events surrounding the conflict in Iran. We have had, in the New York UN context, quite striking budgetary reductions and declines in contributions from a number of major UN contributing countries. And we've had the withdrawal of the United States, the champion of this world order. We've had the withdrawal of the United States from a number of UN and related agencies across the board. So while I'd said then the atmosphere was cloudy, it's definitely gotten in many ways a lot worse. And this is something obviously of particular concern to smaller countries who rely on a well-ordered or a reasonably well-ordered international system for their continued, in some respects, to be perfectly frank, for their continued survival and certainly for their ability to develop and prosper. So next slide, please. And I had said in my presentation in October that one of the really deeply problematic issues to do with our ability to face the climate crisis, in particular for developing countries, was that finance was lacking. It's still lacking, but, and if you'll move on to the next slide, please, Kate, we have seen some important developments, and Danielle, you hinted at a few of these in your opening remarks. We have seen a few important developments coming out of the COP in Belém, and if, Kate, you press the slide thing one more, I'll just highlight 3 which are of particular, sorry, go back to the previous slide. I'll just highlight 3 outcomes of Belém which are of particular importance to Barbados and a lot of small island developing states and developing countries more broadly. And these, and as I said, I'm going to focus here on the finance because this is, in a way, one of the most problematic and one of the areas in which we have made the least amount of progress. But looking on the positive side, out of Belém, we got an important new commitment on finance, the 1.3 trillion per year by 2035 for developing countries. This had been, a target long in the making, and as imperfect as it is, we now have an important target. We had, for small island developing states and vulnerable countries in general, we had a very important commitment on the tripling of adaptation finance. This has been a sore point for many of us over the years, and this is an important gain. And thirdly, we have a built-in 2-year work program on climate finance in the COP system. And I think these are 3 important developments that we left Belém with, feeling that, as I said, despite the well-known imperfections of the COP system, these are 3 important cornerstones for progress to deal with the climate crisis. Next slide, please. And then this is a kind of a slightly separate but related point on finance, and it will connect to a broader point that I will make it in the following slide. A number of developing countries, and I will cite my own because I know it best, obviously. A number of developing countries, having seen the slow progress being made in the COP context of finance, have been working at the national and at the regional level to develop new financial instruments to deal with the climate crisis. So for a long time, we have been saying finance needs to come from the international financial system, needs to come from donor countries, it needs to come from rich countries, there needs to be a transfer, climate justice related financial transfers from the emitters to those countries such as my own, which are emitting the least and suffering the most. And while we continue to stick to our guns in terms of principle, and we have seen some important evolutions as I highlighted in the previous slide, it's also clear that this is simply not enough. And so many countries, my own included, are beginning to turn to financial innovation to see what can be done at the national and at the regional level. And this is a slide here. I won't go into the details, but it's a slide which simply illustrates an experiment that Barbados conducted in 2024 and 2025, in which we essentially repurposed some domestic debt through the domestic banking system, obtained, consolidated a series of bonds, repurposed them at lower rates of interest, used the international financial architecture to provide guarantees. So we got guarantees from the Inter-American Development Bank and the European Investment, and essentially created a mechanism which allowed us to lower the interest payments on the debt. And with the savings from those lowered interest payments, to invest those savings into a series of climate and resilience focused national and regional projects. And we've been playing around with a number of instruments like these, including a number of debt swaps. So this is not the only part of the future of climate finance, but it is an increasingly important part of the future for climate finance for countries like that. And in a way, this is something which is in addition to, parallel to the COP process, which is beginning to bear fruit in a way which was not possible before, in large part because developing countries are being given the opportunity, are creating the opportunities for themselves for new partnerships with international banking, the international financial system. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I would say two things, and in a way, Danielle, I'm going to echo some of your remarks as well. I would say the first thing is the COP process, which has all of the imperfections we all know about, is still absolutely essential. It's still doing the work of setting the norms, giving the issues around climate science and climate finance a high degree of visibility, but it's simply not enough. Having said that, it's also important not to underestimate the power, and I say this as a long-suffering diplomat, it's important not to underestimate the power of the lowest common denominator. We often say, it's the lowest common denominator, that's not great. That's true, it's not great, but it is a very important tool, and despite its limitations, is showing its power. And I think we saw some of that in Belém. And then the second point, notwithstanding the first point, is that we, developing countries in particular, we have a responsibility to our own people, to ourselves, to break the mold, to try things that we were perhaps unable to try before, including in the finance area, in order to free up capital of different types, public sector, private sector, to free up this capital to address the climate challenges which are increasingly urgent across the world. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions and make any further remarks on the presentations from colleagues, which I am really looking forward to. And I do apologize if I sound a little bit sleepy and tired. It is because it's 4:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And not at all. You sound perfectly lucid, perfectly clear, and very, very glad to have your important comments on the issue of finance, which is a particular importance to countries in your region, and the innovative models. And that's a great segue actually to our next speaker. which I will now move on now to the ASEAN region. And we're very privileged today to have two speakers from that region. One who's from Malaysia, our next speaker, who's the immediate past president of the ASEAN chair, sorry, not president, but the immediate past chair of the ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to be followed by a speaker from the Philippines, who is now the current ASEAN chair, so to speak. And the sanctuary also works very well because our next speaker is steeped in the world of finance, and that's Datuk Muhammad Faizami, who's the executive chairman of the Securities Commission of Malaysia since June 2024. He chaired the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum in conjunction with Malaysia's ASEAN Chairmanship in 2025 and has led the development of the ASEAN's Capital Market Master Plan 4 that's from 2026 to 2030. And prior to his appointment, Dr. Azmi had served also as the chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers Malaysia. So over to you, Dr. Azmi.
Thank you, Daniela, and Petra as well for the invitation to come share. So maybe I should just start by saying that we are very grateful that the conversation of financing actually happened in Belém. But of course, they've been talking about money for a very long time. So of course, one of the expectations we have in this region is to translate talk to money. So what I'll do in the next few minutes is to quickly touch on what's happening in ASEAN with particular regard to Malaysia. And I'm sure my colleague speaking after me, Undersecretary Annalisa, will pick up the Philippine part because certainly it is of great concern in her country too. So let me just share my slides. Oh, good. I need to help. So, sorry, slide. Yeah. Okay. Can you see my slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Right. Okay. So let me. Sorry, it's gone that one. Right. So on the left is basically what came out of COP in terms of adaptation, just transition, and protecting forests. And of course, all these things are relevant to us in this part of the world. So whether you talk about water risk, certainly we are expecting a lot more in the way of floods and droughts, in terms of heat waves, also the changing in terms of weather patterns, but also, frankly, the global biodiversity loss. In this part of the world, where I think 5 out of the top 20 most vulnerable countries are actually in our region, and there is an estimate that something like 40% of our GDP could be wiped out if we don't try to address that now. And again, tying into Ambassador's point about financing, we reckon that in this part of the world, we need at least 200 billion a year to be able to address some of those issues. So what are we doing in ASEAN? I think at the bottom, we've kind of highlighted that we, like most parts of the world, are looking at net zero, looking at adaptation plans, and also committing to reducing these things. Of course, our range of dates may seem a bit less aggressive than most, but I think it just also reflects that many countries in ASEAN are actually still in the developing stage. So we'll need a bit more time to get there.
I think you've just muted yourself, Dato.
Yep, sorry, excellently. So, so having talked about ASEAN, I'm just going to bring it back down to Malaysia. So as I mentioned, the 3 major risks are there: water, heat, and biodiversity. As a country, we've followed many of the commitments requested vis-a-vis net zero and carbon emissions. But I would have to say that our plans to address those 3 major risks are still developing. I think it's further advanced when you talk about energy. We do have a climate change bill coming in, but our adaptation plan and therefore our assessment of what we need is still a bit limited. Now, I chair the capital markets regulator, and 2 days ago we launched our plan for the next 5 years. And rather unusually for a capital market regulator, in addition to the usual things about the market, we actually have one of our central pillars, which is essentially financing these sustainability goals. So that's something I'll touch on a bit later. This next slide basically just illustrates 2 or 3 things from that sustainability pillar. So we are going to look at blended finance, both for transition as well as adaptation. I think the rather unique thing in this part of the world is that there are pots of capital which are actually there for social welfare. So, for example, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia actually have zakat authorities, taxes. And so we're trying to make a case to the religious authorities that they should use some of that money towards some of this adaptation needs. Also, with the private sector, we've been talking to a number of parties around the world, and there seems to be some interest in giving concessional capital, maybe some philanthropic, in order to fund some of the things that we need. On the right-hand side, is just to say that at ASEAN level, we've agreed a common taxonomy for sustainable finance. It kind of differs a little bit from the European one, but again, it's about trying to standardize and to explain to people in the world what kind of money do we need and for what purpose. The one at the bottom is a bit unusual. We have this thing called Mars, and really the problem statement we're trying to solve is this. Most adaptation projects are not bankable. And if they're not bankable, ultimately the government will have to raise taxes to pay for it. So our problem statement is, how do I bank unbankable projects? And so blended finance will be part of the answer, but it's also tapping on these concessional capital and social capital to do so. This next slide then talks about transition financing. So one of the unusual things in Asia is that we're a little bit like Europe, where we too have a battery. Our battery is not Norway. Our battery is actually a state in Malaysia called Sarawak, which actually has a lot of hydro dams. And a lot of the discussion in ASEAN is how to connect everyone to this battery. So there are plans to link Sarawak with the Philippines, Sarawak with Singapore, plans to connect Malaysia with Vietnam, and also Sumatra, and so on and so forth. It is a very ambitious idea, but the idea is to kind of tap on each country's natural resources. So you would have thought in our part of the world we would have a lot of wind, but apparently if you sit on the equator, there's not much wind. So there's no point having wind farms, for example, in Malaysia. But it does make sense up in Vietnam and Laos. On our side, we have a lot of sun, so it actually makes more sense having solar farms than anything else. So the whole idea is to try and blend this and make sure that the region has sustainable power, renewable power. This last few slides is just to say that we're one of the first few countries in ASEAN that has adopted the ISSB S1, S2 disclosures. This was deliberate because we felt that as a regulator of the capital markets, it's important to have that discussion with the companies about what are their backup plans. What are you going to do when you have too much rain or too little water? And I'm pleased to say that based on the results of the first batch, I think many of the companies are beginning to understand this is much beyond compliance. This is survival. This ties into another agreement we've had at ASEAN. We realized that one of the ways to get polluters to pay is through the voluntary carbon markets. However, all of us have tried doing it individually, but we've not done it in a very cohesive way. So the ASEAN countries last year agreed to try and do things more consistently with similar, policies. And so in Malaysia, we're taking that opportunity to kind of rethink what we're doing in Malaysia. But the kind of products that we're planning to trade are not just carbon credits. Malaysia, for example, is working with Korea and Japan to create CCUS, absorption of carbon and then pumping it back into the ground. And so that may well be another asset class to trade, which is CCUS credits, also potentially even green credits, because taking advantage of the fact that we have these hydro dam powers. And then I think that's basically it. So maybe just in conclusion, ASEAN is a vulnerable area. Money is in short supply. And it is something that is not just an issue at governmental level, but even the capital market regulators are now being brought into that conversation because they all appreciate that the need is there. But the question is, how do you mobilize private money to support these adaptation projects? So with that, I'll hand back to you, Danielle.
Thank you very much, Dato, for sharing those insights. I think it's quite a rich sort of pot of insights to delve into, which I hope we will get into during the conversation. But just to remind ourselves that I think what struck me was really as between the first Ambassador Jackman's and your comments is the focus on finance, and the use of finance to address vulnerabilities, existential threats, so to speak. But also the key question is having secured that kind of a commitment and reaffirmation on finance and COP30. The question is, how do we move that to operationalization? How to move that implementation? When you have, as you have described, what we call unbankable or not as bankable projects. So that suggests that whatever sort of pressures there are on national budgets, this reliance in a significant way on public finance and remains very important, public sources. But how do we pull in private sources? How do we pull in social capital? The concerns you've shared about diversity, heat, and water, those are common to many regions of the world. The question is how can we learn from each other's responses? And particularly interested, I think, in the conversation later on this idea of collaboration more in sharing the sources of green energy, which the APG, the ASEAN Power Grid, seeks to do. And perhaps in the conversation, we can go into a little bit further about what the challenges has been, because that conversation and APG has been going on for what, 20 years. And it was only last year in Malaysia in October that there was a really significant uptick as well, in understandings, in an sort of an agreement to focus on things like common standards, the technical aspects of what would make an ASEAN power regional grid actually work. And those will be, I think, quite important questions that we need to ask ourselves. And your final point on the involvement of private capital bringing in carbon credits, very interesting idea of CCUS, which I hope we can also find some time to deliberate later. So now staying within the ASEAN region, it is my great pleasure now to pass the baton to Attorney Annalisa Rebuilta Tay, who's the Undersecretary for Finance, Information Systems, and Climate Change of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Philippines. The Philippines, as I mentioned, is the current ASEAN chair. And Undersecretary Tay has served in various positions within the Philippines government as a government lawyer, and she was appointed, among others, as also Undersecretary of and Chief of Staff, supervising Undersecretary for Mining, supervising Undersecretary for Environment. So a great blend of various policy perspective as well as legal perspective to bring to the table today. Undersecretary Tay has also served as the chairperson of the Intergovernmental session for the East Asian Seas Partnership Council from 2013 to 2016. My great pleasure now to invite you, Undersecretary Tay, to share with us your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and would like also to thank the Durham University and National University of Singapore for inviting the Philippines, particularly our department, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So what we have prepared this afternoon is based on the topic for the roundtable discussion. First, on the highlights from COP30 that are most important to our region, especially for the Philippines. First, I'd like to mention about the out of the Belém political package that was presented, we can say that the Tropical Forest Forever facility is one item that we feel something that we can look forward to. Of course, there are several several observations about this facility, like not having the $4 per hectare is quite low, but we believe that this is something that we can address as we go along. But we feel that this facility can help us demonstrate a long-term strategy for paying for standing forests. Another BELEM outcome that we feel is relevant for the region would be the adoption of the adaptation and the BELEM indicators. Here, we've been discussing this, the indicators for the adaptation. We know that it is really more, what was adopted was really more on how we will demonstrate adaptation, not really much on the financing, how we will measure whether or not the requirements or the commitments for financing are met. However, this is something that we can start with so that we can proceed implementing adaptation measures and come up with a more evidence-based, science-based uh, type of decision making on how to be more effective in our adaptation work, and also again demonstrate that financing is really needed in this work stream. The third one I think would be on the ocean and climate nexus. The Philippines is an archipelagic country, and we see that this is very important for us, especially now as we develop our carbon policy. We are also looking at our blue carbon, and we see that this decision can, or this outcome can really be a basis to pursue high integrity blue carbon in identifying as one of the climate solutions. Now, in terms of the key developments since COP30 that we feel are relevant, that we have already moved on, as you know, the Philippines has been selected as the host country for the board of the fund responding to the loss and damage. And um, based on the call for proposal last December, the Philippines is now preparing to submit its proposal that is more integrated in our approach, and really addressing, focusing on slow onset events, and the need to prioritize vulnerable communities in those climate vulnerable provinces. Another development since COP30 that we would like to highlight is uh, based on the decision on with the global multi-row in the Philippines. We have we call it Bayanihan, or the Filipino collective spirit. I think this is where we can demonstrate the nexus between the biodiversity loss and climate change, and um, this can help us further uh, identify actions to support our nature-based solutions, particularly on ocean governance and integrated coastal management. The third one would be the dialogue on mountains and climate change. Um, there were identified mountain-specific indicators within the global goal on adaptation, and this will be useful for us to ensure watershed protection, and we would like to work on this, and in terms of mapping the stability of our watersheds, and we would like to share that this is something that we have to work with Vietnam and Myanmar, so that we can ensure that the impacts of climate change in our mountains are tracked with the same urgency as sea level rise. So I, and then in terms of the priority areas that we look forward for COP31. One, of course, I share the same thing with His Excellency Ambassador Jackman. Financing is really an issue. Um, we are trying to update our ambition through the NDC updating, but although we tried to uh, increase our unconditional commitment, financing would still be needed to really support the conditional portion of our targets for on mitigation. The second one is we need also to related also to financing is to increase the commitment to funding the fund for responding to loss and damage. The first call proposal is a good start to demonstrate what are really the needs of the developing countries. But again, financing would be needed uh, to be more transformational in the kind of projects that have to be implemented at the community level. And finally, we still would like to push through for the 1.5 degree centigrade target. We know that in the last global stock take that we are expecting that we will not be able to meet that target in 2030, but still that is something that we should really push in COP31 so that developed countries would really clearly define its position regarding the phase out of fossil fuel. In the case of the Philippines, we have formulated our energy transition roadmap, and we are also moving from gradual phase out, but we are accelerating our transition to renewable energy. Right now, the percentage of our energy mix, renewable energy to our total energy mix is 21%. We are targeting additional 30% to increase it to 35% in 2030 and to 50% in 2040. But again, investments, financing, and technology will be needed. And overall, parallel to our energy transition is the completion of our Just Transition Framework, which we will actually launch during the ASEAN chairship. And we have identified the different the different reshaping, revitalizing in our social systems, in our um, employment support system and social protection system to really support the uh, informal workers, the industrial workers from fossil fuel industries, and even the subsistent farmers who will be affected by the change in land use and industrial shift as well. So we think that these are the items that we still have to push through in COP31. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Tay, for sharing with us those insights in terms of priorities and where to focus on, and how Philippines is dealing with this issue and projecting forward for COP31 as well, the areas of focus on. What I would be curious about, which I hope we can spend some time later, is as the current ASEAN chair, how do you see the priorities from Philippines perspective as the chair that is important for the region to move forward and to focus on? I think, though, if you could share some of those initiatives and some of those priorities as the chair, and in the course of the year, the cycle, what are the what perhaps initiatives you'd like to highlight? That would be very helpful. I think it really enrich our cross-regional exchange today on some or all the issues you face. And I think there are also some commonalities. Again, a great focus on finance, but I appreciate it very much you drawing attention to the mountains and climate dialogue and how that actually affects watersheds and the focus and attention that needs to be brought to that, as well as the continued focus on the ocean, or should we say the elevated focus on oceans and climate, and how that could impact on things like blue carbon and so on and so forth. So very much appreciate your intervention on those comments. So now let's move across the world, moving now to the African region. And I'm very pleased to introduce Ms. Caroline Aguti, the Assistant Commissioner for Health, Safety, Environment, and also the Coordinator for Climate Change for the Ugandan Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. She's a very highly accomplished climate change practitioner with over 23 years of dedicated experience in energy, in extractives, nature-based solutions, spanning key areas such as decarbonization strategies, air climate finance, stakeholder engagement, and policy development. And a warm and huge thanks to you as well, Ms. Kaduti. I realize that you're also, like Ambassador Chapman, joining us from New York, given a very early hours of the morning. So very much appreciate your participation today. Delighted to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, so first and foremost, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development in Uganda and the government of Uganda and Africa at large appreciates the invitation to participate and to share our COP30 key highlights and what progress we are making and what we really expect should be able to progress at COP31. We really appreciate the university for supporting us and for the recent interaction with our ministry on how we can actually be able to engage in terms of fossil fuels and NDCs. So specifically, we can go to the next slide. I think I have been introduced. So we can go to the next slide where we are really focusing on what were the key highlights for Africa in terms of COP30. And again, we are all talking about really finance, because definitely what was very critical was the outcome of tripling adaptation finance. That should be able to enable us to invest in terms of infrastructure, agriculture, water resilience, and the ability to, the indication that we shall be able to mobilize 120 billion per year. One of the key things that we need to take note of that, yes, Africa submitted their NDCs and some African countries have already submitted their updated NDCs. But as Uganda prepares to submit its updated NDC, one of the key things that is coming out is the issue of finance, means of implementation. And we see that Uganda will not really raise its ambition in terms of its updated NDC, because in terms of what we actually received as a country, what was budgeted for in our NDC, we only managed to receive 3% of that. So raising ambition is not very easy, and definitely adaptation is a very critical area for Africa. So we are really appreciative of what came out, but now we want to see actual implementation. One of the key highlights we also saw was really the aspect of the loss and damage fund getting into operation to really be able to help us to address the climate shocks, droughts, floods. One of our key areas that is really being affected is our Rwenzori Mountains, which is one of those snow-capped mountains that were known world over. But now the challenges that we have in that area is the melting of the glacier that is really affecting most of the infrastructure and the communities. That is a very good progress, but the resources available is really a drop in the ocean. And if we are all going to be looking out for this, we realize that maybe only in terms of Africa, we might find only 13 countries being able to access, if we really looked at the cap of the 20 million USD that is available. So we need to see in the next round that the countries that are really responsible for what we are suffering from right now should be able to up the game and get us more resources into that. Uganda definitely is also preparing to submit its proposal for loss and damage with a focus on the Rwenzori Mountains, focusing on the slow onset events. Our other key highlight was also on support to renewable energy. The just transition discussions really focused on renewable energy tripling as a result of the outcome of what came out in UAE. So we are really focusing on renewable energy, and you'll appreciate that most of Africa is really on renewable energy. And we are also focusing the outcome of the just transition that will enable Africa to expand its electricity access and clean energy investment. But what was also very critical was the outcome of the just transition mechanism, because we feel this will really be able to support us to push our differentiated needs. If we have a mechanism in place, then we should be able to tailor that to our unique situations. But also definitely the aspect of the oil and gas not coming out in the text, and us focusing on the aspect of a specific conference that will bring together the oil producing countries to be able to discuss how their transition pathways will be, was a good one, because many of the African countries are emerging producers, and they expect that they are going to use these resources for economic development, but also to be able to invest in renewable energy. Next. Next. Who is managing the slide? Okay. So in terms of what we expected what are key developments, I am on the next slide on the key developments since COP30. We must say, yes, there. So we must say that we can't say that from COP30 we have developed anything very new, but we have definitely made lots of progress and improving what is existing, because many of the African countries currently have transition plans. And those transition plans, we are really focusing on scaling our renewable energy to increase access that will attract investments. Many of the African countries are endowed with natural resources. So we are really seeing how we are focusing to see how we can be able to focus on the role of the critical minerals and how the critical minerals can enable us to triple our renewable energy potential. And that will be a very big area for investment, both in terms of energy access, but also in terms of value addition for the critical minerals. But also we are still pursuing the aspects of advancing adaptation and resilience programs linked to climate finance. And indeed, Africa is trying to put up a spirited fight by responding to many of the calls to ensure that you actually tap into the existing climate finance, but also strategically managing extractive resources as a funding source for just transition. This one is very critical for us, and Uganda is making very great strides as we get into oil and gas production to actually ensure that we deploy these resources into renewable energy, but also as we extract our resources, we emphasize the aspect of ensuring that we use renewable energy in the production of these resources. So in my next slide, my last slide, which should be really the priorities for COP31. But also you see that as we do this, the African countries are now focusing on the aspect of developing the country platforms, which should really be able to enable us to develop a pipeline of bankable projects that we should be able to provide or give to the different donors, that will enable us to be able to access blended financing, but also have the role of the private sector in implementation of these projects going forward. So country platforms is one of the things we are advancing through our coalition of African ministers, of the coalition of finance ministers on climate change. And Uganda is indeed advancing 3 country platforms, one on energy, green energy transition, but also we are focusing one on agriculture, which will be focusing on adaptation. And definitely climate finance, which will be a cross-cutting one. So what would be some of our key priority areas for COP31? Definitely the focus on climate finance delivery and the access mechanisms. Because yes, we have talked about what it means to get the climate finance, but we really want to see this get into operation by ensuring the accessibility to the climate finance, existing climate finance mechanisms that are available, like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility. We need to see that the accessibility is eased, because it is still challenging for us to get access to the Green Climate Fund because of the modalities and what it takes, the time it takes to get that funding. And we also want to see increased grant funding for adaptation. So we want to see these mechanisms progress at COP31. But also the implementation, the global goal on adaptation. Yes, we have developed the indicators, but now we really want to see the implementation framework. What are the systems for measurements for adaptation? The national adaptation planning frameworks and financing for adaptation implementation. So we really want to see this. I see one of us made a comment and say that adaptation projects are not bankable. But we really want to see what would be the measurement systems for adaptation. And definitely the aspect of the just transition pathways for developing countries. We really want to see the mechanism that was put in place in COP31 for the just transition. We want to see how the discussions in shaping up the implementation of the mechanism will progress. But we also want to see partnerships, because without partnerships, then you can't get finance. We need to focus on the aspects of technology transfer for clean energy and transitioning of fossil fuel dependent economies. So this would be some of our key areas that we really want to see progress. We definitely have carbon market regulations as a country, and we are already progressing that front, but we really want to see what the COP will really practically put in place in terms of where we should be able to get to. And we are all looking forward to the discussions that are going to happen in March and in April in terms of the Just Transition Conference that is going to be talking about transitioning away from the fossil fuels. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Agoti, for sharing the perspectives from your region and certainly highlighting finance, which so far has been a really key priority and focus. And just coming from the comments from our speakers so far, and the question is, how do we make sure that happens? What are the innovative financing tools? How can we best bring in other sources of capital as well? And I was curious, and I think I hope we can develop further, because you talked about critical minerals as well, and that of course did not feature in the eventual COP30 decisions, although it was certainly raised and discussed substantively in the course of COP30. And one question I had is to what extent you think, and perhaps other speakers as well, later in our dialogue, should this feature in COP, and how would you like this? Do you envisage this issue of critical minerals featuring in COP31? It's a supply chain shock issue. Is COP the appropriate forum, a platform? How do we integrate that discussions into the just transition discussions, for instance? And so that's something that we can hopefully find some time to focus on during our roundtable. So in the absence of Professor Elisa Morgera, I will now move on and invite, last but certainly not least, my colleague Petra to speak to us on this topic. Now, she is the Associate Pro Vice Chancellor Sustainability at Durham University, as well as the Professor of International Law and Director of Durham's University Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy. And she also heads the university's COP steering group, having led the university's COP30 delegation to Belém, Brazil, and has also provided strategic leadership throughout. Now, Petra works at the intersection of law and science in the context of sustainability, climate change, and environmental protection. And I'm very excited to turn the floor and to hear from here today, not just on the sharing her perspective from Durham, from Europe, but also bring us back also to some of the legal issues and some of the key legal developments and what she sees as areas in which at least the legal dialogue, the legal policy science dialogue needs to move ahead on at COP30. So Petra, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and that's certainly a very steep challenge. And I think the previous speakers have also set the bar very high. In the interest of time, I would try to only raise a few brief comments with you, but I would also like to mention one point, actually, as you said, Professor Morgera cannot be here for unforeseen circumstances, but I would like to maybe note on her behalf that in her role as Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Climate Change, she has done a lot of work on climate change and human rights on the ground during COP30, was involved in many engagements and is now leading on a conference, which is the academic pre-conference to the Colombia-Netherlands-led conference later in April, the Santa Marta Conference on Defossilization. So this conference will take place next week, actually, in Durham in a hybrid function. So if you would like to join, that's still possible to register for that conference. And it is co-led with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I think this is a really important outcome also from COP30 to stress the importance of how do we defossilize our economies. And I think this is maybe a point that we can take into consideration on her behalf, even though she cannot be here today.
Thanks
so
very
thank
much,
you.
Petra.
Yeah.
That's important. If I could ask perhaps Kate to if you could drop that into the chat function, the link to this pre-academic CAFM conference. I think that'd be very useful. Thank you.
I've just done that, so that's done now.
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, there are also various initiatives of a more political nature in terms of how do we dispel some of the climate disinformation. That is one of the outcomes also where she was quite heavily involved. Now, you asked me to talk from a European perspective, and I will do so to some extent, but also use the international law lens to do that. And I will make 3 points or center my points on 3 different facets that came out from COP30. So one is the mutirao and the language on 1.5 degrees Celsius. One is the outcome of the GSD and the implementation of the GSD outcomes in NDCs 3.0 and the just transition mechanism that was adopted. So this COP, we are always trying to call the COP something, like the COP in Baku was called the Article 6 COP or the Finance COP. So what kind of COP was this one? I again read yesterday that somebody said this was also an Article 6 COP. I'm not so sure because all these rules on Article 6 have actually been finalized. So maybe this was then the implementation COP, or it should be seen as the implementation COP. And I very much like the remarks of Undersecretary saying that now the next one should be the impact COP. I think that would be a very distinct characteristic for the next COP. I also absolutely agree with Ambassador Jackman in saying that these COP processes are very important, even though there are other processes, as also Dr. Faiz has pointed out, there are these processes around financing, and we've heard a lot on financing, and these points are really important. However, I would like to add that in international law, we are often confronted with a situation where the fabric we have to work with is becoming thinner and thinner. And this could be a cause for desperation, but it can also give us hope and more determination to find what can we still work with. And I would like to concentrate on those points where I think we can still work even with what has come out of COP30. I know there was disappointment in terms of the language. There was no reiteration of the language on defossilization, phasing out fossil fuels, as we had seen starting from COP26 down to the COP outcome that was then the global stocktake decision at COP28. We haven't seen that, so there is maybe a pause in using that language. But what we still see, and this brings me to the first point, is in the Mutirao, a strong emphasis on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think this is absolutely critical because many international lawyers will have shared this fear that following the ICJ's advisory opinion with the focus on the new consensus target of 1.5, there could have been a reversal in the appetite of states to again focus on this 1.5 target. Because what we learned from the advisory opinion of the ICJ is that these COP decisions have this interpretative function in developing treaty language. So even though the long-term temperature goal is set as well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally closer to 1.5, the court found that in light of the IPCC evidence and in light of the COP decisions, there is a new consensus target on 1.5 degrees Celsius. So now for some states, that could have been an incentive to change their interpretative methods and not adopting a decision that really strongly focuses in the Mutirao, but also on the GST outcome and the just transition pathway outcome on 1.5. So again, we've seen this underscoring that the risk and impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 compared with 2 degrees Celsius. That is in the Mutirao. And there is an acknowledgement that the global transition towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient developments is irreversible and the trend of the future. So whenever we feel that there wasn't much of an outcome in terms of a new legal decision or a new building of new law, these are elements that are legally very relevant for the interpretation of the Paris Agreement and for the pathways that lie ahead of all countries. So this is really important. Yes, of course, we can say that maybe a stronger emphasis on where parties haven't submitted NDCs, even at the COP30, could have been also contributing to strengthening the rule of law and the feeling that this is a legal obligation. Everyone needs to comply with that. But at the same time, I think having this emphasis on the 1.5 language is really important. And this is not just in the preambular paragraphs of the decision. It's also, and it culminates in the Mutirao decision in the sentence where it's about the decision to launch under the guidance of the presidencies of the 6th, 7th, and 8th sessions of the Conference of Parties under the Paris Agreement, the Belém mission to 1.5. So this is something that from an international law perspective, we should take really very seriously and take forward in our work and in our collaborative efforts to keep this on the road. And then the GST outcome also the decision that is called the matters related to the GST outcome. What we see again here is an encouragement of the scientific community to provide best available scientific inputs to feed into the global stocktake. Now, we also know that the ICJ found that best available science comes from the IPCC reports. And we are now in the 7th cycle of producing a new round of IPCC reports. And here we see this even mentioning of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its input to the global stocktake. And that is relevant for the past global stocktake, but also for the next one, for the second that will open very soon for inputs. And again, IPCC is recognized here and is recognized as delivering the best available scientific evidence. And that is, from a legal perspective, again, very important outcome. And this is by no means something we should take for granted, because those who have followed the processes very closely will know that when the IPCC launched the 1.5 report, special report on global warming, there was an intense debate at COP. How should this report be received by parties? And instead of appreciating and this report, it was appreciated only in terms of its timely delivery. And that was done with a specific purpose to maybe not give it this signal as being the best available scientific evidence. It was only welcomed for a timely submission ahead of that COP, but not so much for the content and as a piece of best available scientific evidence. So this stressing of the science again is really important and significant. And then one point that was really contentious, I think, was again this just transition mechanism, or the framework, moving it from a dialogue to a framework to something that is maybe more tangible now, that will allow countries to deliver in line with the CBDR principle their own just transition pathways. So again, the pathways that have been mentioned are not 2 degrees Celsius pathways, they are 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. So in the decision, we find the wording of emphasize the inherent connection between pursuing efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius and pursuing just transition pathways. So this is relevant. This is a piece of an interpretative tool for understanding the objectives of the Paris Agreement around these just transitions. So yes, they will be implemented in a nationally determined manner. They will be state-led, but they will also be tied to this global temperature target. And then another point to mention also is that the decision here acknowledges the impact of the LT-LETs. As we know, this is not a legal obligation to have an LT-LET, but having these low emission development strategies in place is something that parties have again committed themselves to do. So this is very important. And then the operational part here, again, it decides to develop a just transition mechanism, the purpose of which will be to enhance international cooperation. And again, in the current geopolitical climate, and Ambassador Jackman pointed this out, we are moving from cloudy to stormy to hopefully back to more sunnier weathers at one point, but it is really significant that there is this focus on international cooperation, and we shouldn't give that away in this political discourse too easily. So it's really important to keep the emphasis on this. And it's also, again, tied to capacity building, to knowledge sharing, but also to equity. And I think that ties back into what we have discussed here today already, and that is the finance mechanism. And I think there's a lot of expertise here on this particular area. And I hope we can discuss some of these points now during the next, during the remaining 20 minutes that we have. So thank you again very much.
Thank you very much, Petra, for bringing together the key legal aspects of COP30 in your perspective, and how that actually impacts on the discussions to follow. Very rich vein, and I wanted to give this opportunity to the speakers to elaborate on or respond to each other's comments that we have heard. And Petra has actually already provided a very good sort of a summation, in fact, of the key elements from each speaker. And please, can I also invite and encourage participants, use the Q&A function that you see to raise your questions to the panelists. This is a valuable opportunity that we have today. And I wanted to start, if I may, with a comment from Ambassador Jackman, which Petra also talked about. This we can't run away from the elephant in the room, right? The current geopolitical events is indeed a superstorm. And that has sort of impacts on countries' economic development. We're talking about revision downward of economic GDP forecasts, growth forecasts. And this is a very real question of how it would impact being on competing national priorities. The economic shock from the stratospheric oil prices. Now, does that actually sort of indicate a sort of, in fact, a key wake-up call? Do you see that as a wake-up call, for perhaps an over-reliance on fossil? Because, with the oil prices going, you have economic shock. Do you think this is a plus or a minus in terms of moving the conversation on climate towards renewable, non-fossil based sources of energy? And I wanted to leave that as an open question for any of the panelists to respond to. And perhaps, Ambassador Jackman, I could invite you to start first if your reflections on that, since this is something you mentioned. Should we be looking at less public finance, more on philanthropic finance? Is there more role for private sector? What do you think? And how would it affect the conversation that Petra just mentioned, renewing focus on 1.5 and moving away from fossil?
Gosh, Danielle, that's about 7 questions in one you just asked. So I'm just going to pick out a couple of points, if I may, and leave the rest to my better qualified colleagues. Certainly for a country like Barbados, crises, energy price, fossil fuel price crises like the one that we're seeing now are a clear incentive to accelerate a transition to renewable, to a much higher use of renewable energy. This is quite clear. It's quite simple for us, but every country is different. And as we've heard from our colleagues from Uganda, amongst others, there are a number of developing countries, Malaysia, a number of developing countries with significant fossil fuel resources who will have to manage these resources in a different way. But for a country like us, this is a no-brainer. Higher fossil fuel prices drive faster transition to renewable use. Perhaps the second point I wanted to pick up on has been made by, I think, all of the colleagues. Petra called it kind of the thinning of the fabric of international law, and I feel it certainly more broadly the thinning of the fabric of international cooperation under these various pressures that we've been discussing. So obviously this is, on the face of it, a negative. It contains with it, however, I think a number of opportunities, and I think the presentations from our colleagues from the ASEAN region highlight some of the opportunities that there are here. And the 2 types of opportunities arise in this context. One is much greater regionalization of our approaches to these problems. And Dr. Mohammed's leadership in this area in Malaysia is well known. Even for large countries like Malaysia, regional approaches are vital. So you can imagine how much more they will bear fruit for very small countries and very small jurisdictions like those, say, in the Caribbean or the Pacific. So we need to emphasize this regional dimension more as we respond. And then on top of this, the Caribbean can learn from ASEAN. So we need to strengthen the intra-regional linkages that may be developed on an ad hoc basis or projects around ideas. So this is not to say the UN that the global system is to be paid attention to or isn't valuable. It's to say there are other tools, and the intra-regional mechanism, I think, is one in the context of South-South cooperation we've been talking about for a long time. I think we now have additional incentives to make this come alive in new ways, dealing with, as Dr. Mohammed says, dealing with the money, because as all the presentations about, this is really at the heart. So those are the few points I wanted to make. Thanks again, Rudy. It's been fascinating to hear the different perspectives.
Thanks, Ambassador Jackman. If I may take up from your comments and invite Ms. Caroline Aguti to perhaps share or respond or provide a perspective on the same question, because it's absolutely essential from a region like Barbados and the Caribbean in terms of the impact and the acceleration towards decarbonization. But from countries, coming from your perspective, what would you say to what would be the way forward, and what does the oil shock actually portend? Ms. Aguti, could you hear my question? Yeah.
Please say that again.
Yes, no problem. So having heard from Ambassador Jackman, I wanted to turn over the floor to you first. In response to the question on this oil shock, is that a signal actually that we should accelerate more towards decarbonization? But at the same time, you had mentioned, from the perspective of resource-rich countries, from the perspective of just transitions, what challenges are there in moving towards a 1.5 faster and more realistic, in a faster and more timely manner?
Thank you. Like we have said that Africa is a little slow in terms of raising our ambition, because the geopolitical situation is challenging in terms of energy security. Because what happens globally affects what happens in Africa. Because right now, what is happening, the war that is happening, our fuel prices at the pump are raising. So in terms of our own sustainability, that becomes a challenge in terms of reducing carbon emissions, though definitely the African countries are focusing on low carbon development. But without energy security, it becomes very challenging, because then you realize that we provide a lot of subsidies to enable our population cope, to enable our industries actually be able to meet the tariffs that come along when the prices in terms of oil and gas actually goes up. But the priorities of the developed world versus the developing countries, and yet when we go for these negotiations, the focus is on raising ambition. They want the developed world to raise their ambitions. They want the developing countries to raise their ambitions, but the developed world is not ready to provide the means of implementation to support the progress in terms of raising ambitions to low carbon development. Though many of the African countries are really on a low carbon development pathway. So we need to be able to match the means of implementation with raising ambition. And the only way for us as Africa now is to be able to focus on sustainability through focusing on our regional blocks, to see how we can be able to see our energy pools growing, but also seeing if we can be able to work together to do value addition in terms of our critical minerals. You also talked about the issue of the critical minerals. Yes, it did not make it through, but we were almost there. And it is still something that Africa is pursuing. And we believe that maybe at some point we shall get to an area where we shall say that, yes, can we go it the fossil fuel way, where we say we focus on a specific conference that will be looking at countries that have mineral resources that can actually be able to transition to tripling renewable energy. And maybe that will be the way to go, because right now, one of the key critical issues in terms of the critical minerals is some countries progressing well, and they feel in terms of sustainable extraction of the critical minerals, their value chains will be affected. But the UNEA 7 outcomes are very clear, and we are hoping that with what came out under UNEA 7 in terms of the environment issues pertaining to mineral resources, we should be able to progress with that when it comes to COP31 in terms of having critical minerals in the text. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So that's one issue for us to look to. I'm not sure where this sits in the agendas of the COP31 president, the shared presidency, certainly. But I think what I'm hearing from you is, at least from the African region, you do see this critical minerals as something that's needs more attention and hopefully see some prominence and placement and visibility within the text. I wanted to stick now with this topic of cooperation, regional blocks that was Ambassador Chapman had raised. And if I may turn to Undersecretary Tay and also to Datuk Azmi, and I see your hand up as well, and I certainly will come to you. But may I first invite Undersecretary Tay to perhaps elaborate a little bit more. As a current ASEAN chair, how do you see this regional bloc going? And then I will invite Azmi, Datuk Azmi, to also reflect on that. And if you have also any insights on this, suggestion or more prominence of region to region, inter-regional, cross-regional collaboration, that would be important. But I think there are a lot of lessons from ASEAN, particularly the ASEAN power grid. But I wanted to hear from you what you see are ASEAN's priorities.
Thank you very much again, Daniel. Exactly, that is what we are trying to do now in the ASEAN. There's really need for greater regionalization. So for this ASEAN chairship, Philippines is driving regional collaboration under the context of transition to green economy. For COP30, ASEAN is already prepared. It has a draft statement where we will really elevate our collective voice in COP31. And we will be, as part of the regional collaboration that we would like to push through, we are moving towards policy coherence within the region. In the activities that we have lined up for this year, we will definitely contribute to the climate change strategic action plan of the ASEAN. So there will be discussions on the loss and damage, the carbon market, so that we can see also how carbon markets within the region can interact. Also, regional dialogues on circular economy as part of the transition to green economy will be pursued. And of course, parallel to that is the just transition. We will also pursue the ASEAN power grid for renewable energy. And since we see the projection that renewable energy will form more than almost 90% of energy mix in the ASEAN region, but that will require critical minerals. No, so we are also pushing for a coherence in terms of our shared understanding on what should consist critical minerals in the region and how we can prepare or pursue investment readiness where we can support projects that are responsible and support environmental, social, and climate goals. We will also be pursuing the prosperity corridors where we intend to integrate sustainability in trade and investment. And basically, we would be working on the green jobs. How can we exactly demonstrate green jobs as we transition? Because we will push that people should be at the heart and center of climate action. Thank you.
Thanks very much for sharing that snapshot of ASEAN's, what you see as ASEAN priorities. Very excited to look forward to the ASEAN statement that you referred to and its focus on regionalism. Datuk Azmi, last but not least, I'll turn over the floor to you for your comments as well.
So firstly, on the oil shock, I think it's a good thing because we've been dabbling with replacing diesel with biodiesel for many years. and it still hasn't really caught on. And part of it is obviously the price. If the price of the oil is too cheap, there's really no incentive to go down the biodiesel side. But I think what we now realize from what's happening is that geopolitical shocks means that you cannot assume everything's going to be normal. So I think one outcome of this is we probably need to get to again look at how we power transportation within the region. In terms of financing, I think my feeling is waiting for the global north to come with pots of gold and money is not going to happen. And therefore, we need to take more ownership of the problem. So if I look at my part of the region, the issue to me is not that there's no money available. But the issue to me is the governance around the money. There are many examples in the region where money is raised but squandered. Projects are not finished, projects don't make sense. And so that does not help. I mean, it's already a small pool of money that we're trying to access, but we're squandering that goodwill because we're not executing it properly. So if I go back to one of the ASEAN plans, MARS, mitigation, co-benefit, adaptation, and resilience, as I said, the question we are trying to solve is how do you fund unbankable projects? But within that, you need to also come up with a governance standard about how these projects are to be run. And in many cases, those governance standards must be of a higher quality and much more enforceable than, for example, the local standards. Right? So that's a task that Chairman Francis and I had a conversation with last year, that as we handed over the chairmanship, the next version of Mars is really looking at pilot projects, but coming up with a governance standard for these projects to be able to say that if you put your money in this, the project will finish and it will have the intended outcome. The third part of Mars will be when Singapore chairs ASEAN. And that by then, we hope to come in with a few other tools. So, for example, one way of moving capital is having an organization with better credit rating to guarantee some of these projects. That reduces the cost and it helps with the blending to make it more affordable. So going back to the theme of helping ourselves, the Security Commission launched last month something called the Social Exchange. It's not our idea. We kind of borrowed it from India. And the idea is that charities can come onto our exchange and pitch for money. Now, that's the first phase. The second phase is we'll bring in social impact companies. And the third phase is really climate. In other words, we're preparing for social communities to be able to come onto this platform to pitch and tell us their problems. Because there's no way federal or state government can cover all the losses on a disaster. There must be an ability for the community to come together to help them. And the reason why we created the platform is it's very easy to scam people with donation requests and what have you. But the commitment is that since the Securities Commission is doing this, we will police it and make sure that those requests for donations are actually applied for the intended purpose. But we're starting with charities, but the eventual aim is communities within Malaysia who are affected by climate are able to pitch for help. Right? The final point really is this helping together. You mentioned the ASEAN Power Grid. Again, I know it sounds a bit perverse, but we must thank Donald Trump, because were it not for him, we would not be talking more to each other, right? In fact, I think it was the 2nd of April. I think he launched his retaliatory tariffs, reciprocal tariffs. Was the week that we had our first ASEAN meeting, and so no one wanted to talk about the agenda. Everyone wanted to talk. Well, what are you going to tell Donald? What's your strategy? And what I noticed from that point onwards is that even when I talked to my regional counterparts about what we could do more together, there was far more willingness to concede on certain national policies in the greater interest of doing more together. And that's what we hope under the Philippines chairmanship that we'll see more tangible results, because one of the action plan outcomes we agreed last year is to think of ASEAN as an asset class, not as individual countries.
Thank you very much. Those are very important comments. And I wanted to tie that with Undersecretary Tay's comments about some key elements, perhaps lessons that ASEAN has learned, which can be shared with the world, including the challenges, right? What has accelerated, if I may say, the movement and on the ASEAN Power Grid? This Undersecretary Tay talked about the importance of policy coherence, and all the panelists today have spoken about the importance of cooperation, collaboration, finding pathways within the region. One of the speakers talked about customized, tailor-made approaches, which I think is very important. So how do we sustain that in a very systematic, well thought through, sustained approach that moves in a way Dato' Azmi had described in phases, and pegging on the operational elements and elements that would serve the practicalities and overcome the practical challenges. So thank you very much for the insights. Now I'm mindful of the time, so I will turn over now to Petra to close us off with her words of wisdom, her summation, whatever. But it has been a fascinating discussion. I only wish you had more time. And I thank you for your patience. And I thank you all for the very important contributions today. Petra, to close us off, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you to all the speakers. I think it was a very encouraging, a very positive discussion that we had, and everyone's comments are really so interesting and something to explore now further. I like this notion of we should all move closer together and talk more to each other. And I think this goes across regions. We see the UK is moving closer back to the EU 27. So I think there are some consequences that may not have been intended, but that now we can take forward in a positive way. And for the oil shock, just one thought I had when I was listening to Ambassador Jackman as well. I agree that this is not just a consequence of the war. It's very much, pretty much at the center of why we have this conflict. So having a more diverse approach to how we supply societies with energy would also reduce the potential for conflict and also the devastating consequences of these conflicts. So I think there's more to do, more to explore, and I very much look forward to seeing you all again soon at one of the conferences, hopefully also in person. And yeah, thanks again very much.
Thank you, Petra, and thank you to everyone online for spending this past hour and a half with us. Thank you very much, and good night and good day, everyone. And see you again soon in person or online. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you for moderating. This was really good.
Thank you.